They sat an arm's length apart at a low lacquered table, 5 empty glasses glinting beneath studio lights like unanswered questions. Van Lathan's smile was camera-ready. Meghan's was bulletproof. Table for 5, promised candor. Tonight, it got something closer to combustion. The Table for 5 studio was built to look like a living room that had hired a stylist. Matte charcoal walls, a mossy rug, books aligned in purposeful disorder. Near the back, a neon sign in cursive spelled out "Pull up a chair." The 5th chair remained empty, the show's conceit, and the 4 occupied seats formed a tidy square around a low table scattered with cork coasters and sweating tumblers of still water. Van Lathan introduced the guests with a velvet baritone, each syllable a gentle landing. 2 cultural critics, a young filmmaker, and Meghan Markle. When he said her name, the room's air tightened, the way a theater hushes right before overture. Meghan entered with the calm of someone who already knew where every camera lived. Cream blazer, silk blouse, waves loose around her shoulders, eyes composed. She offered a courteous smile to the panel, then to Van. The smile didn't crack. It also didn't warm. "Meghan, thanks for being here," Van began. "You've said you feel most misunderstood when others do the defining. So tonight, define yourself." She didn't blink. "Mother, wife, producer, someone building things that last." Van nodded. "Builder. All right, let's build." His eyes flicked to the filmmaker. "You had a question." The filmmaker cleared her throat. "A lot of people admire your philanthropy. Some say it's curated. What do you say to that?" Meghan folded her hands, elegant, deliberate. "Curated implies illusion. I prefer focus. If you try to do everything, you do nothing well." Van's brow arched. "Focus can also be a form of control." "It can," she said, meeting his look, "or it can be how women keep their work from being consumed by the noise." A polite murmur rippled across the table. Van let the silence breathe half a beat too long, a producer's silence, shaped like a question mark. "Let's go there," he said finally. "Noise. Since leaving the UK, you've said you stepped back to step into yourself. Yet the spotlight followed. Do you ever worry the message is you?" Meghan's smile thinned. "When a woman owns her story, people accuse her of narcissism. It's an old trick." "One could also call it branding," the first critic said. "Very effective branding." Meghan's gaze didn't move from Van. "Would you prefer I hand my story back to people who profit from distorting it?" Van slid his glass across a coaster that wobbled on an uneven edge. "Here's the cultural tension." He tapped the unstable disc, steadying it with 2 fingers. "Impact versus intention. You intend empowerment. The impact, some say, is fatigue, people feeling marketed, too." "I can't be responsible for people who confuse narrative with advertisement," she said. "I'm responsible for the work." "The work," Van echoed, softening the consonants. "Docuseries, podcasts, children's content. All real. But the public sphere is a 2-way street. You speak, the world speaks back. And the world often speaks without listening first." He smiled. "Touché." The second critic, older and measured, leaned in. "Do you miss anything about the monarchy? Not the institution, the ritual, the weight of continuity?" Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I don't miss mistaking ritual for meaning." Van pounced, but sweetly. "So meaning for you looks like Malibu sunlight and creative meetings?" "Meaning looks like freedom," she said, "where my kids can grow up with options besides ceremony." There was no audience in the room, but you could feel the phantom intake, the collective ooh a crowd would have supplied. Van didn't grin. He glimmered, the way interviewers do when they sense a ridge of flint under the dirt. "Let's talk privilege and pressure," he said. "You've held both. Which one speaks louder in your ear at 3 a.m.? "Pressure is louder," Meghan answered. "Privilege only matters when you decide what to do with it." "And what have you decided?" "To build platforms for voices that weren't handed megaphones." Van rotated his glass, watching condensation trace a ring. Critics would say the megaphone's still mostly pointed at you. Critics are paid to say things. Sure, he said, friendly as a handshake left hanging. But culture keeps receipts. The table shifted. We had reached the first temperature change, not a boil, just the sizzle when butter meets hot iron. The filmmaker ventured a gentler lane. How is Harry handling the noise? Meghan's answer arrived with a velvet sheath. He's a good man who loves his family. We're happy. People may find that boring, but joy often is. Van's eyes narrowed with near affection. He respects a clean parry. Happiness as resistance. I can vibe with that. He turned the wheel again. Still, some argue that every time you respond to the tabloids, you feed the beast. I'm allowed to correct the record, she said. Silence is grace until it becomes complicity. Where's that line? Van asked. When lies harm people who didn't choose this life. And when they only harm you? Meghan held his gaze. I've learned to metabolize it. Van nodded slowly, then changed cadence, the way a DJ shifts BPM without warning. Let's widen the lens. You occupy a space where race, royalty, celebrity, and American myth intersect. That's jet fuel. Do you feel a responsibility to be more than personal? Political? Existing as myself has always been political to someone, she said. I won't perform purity tests to make that easier. The older critic scribbled something. The younger one watched Meghan like she was studying footwork. The fifth chair, empty by design, suddenly felt symbolic. A seat for the ghost. Public expectation. Van leaned back, clasped hands, then leaned in again. A predator's rhythm disguised as compassion. I'll be straight with you. People who look like me, who come from where I come from, have a radar for performance. We hear the uplift, we honor the pain, but we also clock when the thesis feels merchandised. Meghan's lips tensed. And do you apply that radar evenly, or just to women who refuse to play small? Off, Van said, smiling with his eyes as if he'd just tasted heat. That's a worthy jab. I'm not jabbing, she replied, the temperature dropping a degree. I'm asking whether the criticism is about content or comfort. He drummed the table once. Tonight, we'll find out. The stage manager's light winked amber. 2 minutes to break. Van ignored it for a heartbeat. Last beat before we reset. If the UK called tomorrow, no tabloids, no palace politics, just an invitation to reconnect with the charitable machinery there, would you answer? Meghan inhaled through her nose, slow and quiet. I answer every call that serves people rather than crowns. Clever, he said, not unkindly, but crowns cut checks. So do streaming platforms, she said, and sometimes those checks fund schools. Amber turned red. Rap. Van lifted a palm. We'll pick up after the break. Commerce, conscience, and the cost of being believed. He looked into her eyes just long enough to promise he wouldn't let up. She looked back just long enough to promise she wouldn't either. The director called cut. Ice clinked. Someone coughed. A coaster still wouldn't lay flat. And the space between them, polite and polished, felt like a fuse quietly burning under the table. When the cameras came back from commercial, the lighting seemed sharper, or maybe the tension made it feel that way. Meghan adjusted her blazer subtly, as though preparing for round 2. Van leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice smooth and deliberate. Before the break, he said, you talked about freedom, about choosing where your story goes. Let's test that freedom. The filmmaker beside them gave a cautious laugh. Meghan didn't. She tilted her chin slightly, eyes steady. Go ahead. Van smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly. Just the kind of smile that said he was about to dismantle something carefully built. You've built a brand on empowerment, authenticity, breaking barriers. But some people... He paused, looking down the table as if consulting invisible advisors. Some people think the empowerment part only started once the cameras were rolling again. That maybe, just maybe, you've turned struggle into strategy. A quiet ripple passed through the crew. Meghan's lips parted, not in shock, but in controlled disbelief. So, I should apologize for learning from experience? Van's eyes glinted. Not at all. But I think people want to know if this is the real you, or the version fine-tuned for Netflix. The tension clicked like ice in a glass. Meghan leaned in slightly, her tone calm but surgical. You mean, do I owe the public proof that I'm authentic? Because if that's the metric, we'll all fail. Authenticity isn't performance. It's consistency. Sure, Van replied, but consistency cuts both ways. When you say you don't read the press, and then respond to it, that's not consistent. When you say you don't want attention, and then do global interviews, people see that as contradiction. Meghan inhaled deeply through her nose, the way someone does when they've rehearsed grace under fire. No, that's participation. There's a difference between being silent and being silenced. I'm not playing the victim. I'm reclaiming my own narrative. The older critic murmured, That's fair. But Van wasn't finished. He clasped his hands, elbows still on the table. You know, Meghan, I think a lot of people respect what you've done. But some also feel you've made pain your currency. That maybe every interview, every documentary, every podcast has to come with a confession. The remark landed like a slap wrapped in velvet. Even the camera operator hesitated before reframing. Meghan blinked once, slowly. So, if I talk about the pain, I'm exploiting it. If I don't, I'm hiding it. There's no winning there, is there? Van gave a small shrug. You chose the seat. Comes with the lights. Her voice lowered, deliberate, cold enough to draw focus. And what seat are you in, Van? The one that gets to decide which women's voices are worth hearing, and which ones are too polished to be believed. He smiled faintly, but his posture stiffened. I ask what people ask me to ask. That's my job. No, Meghan said softly. Your job is to tell the truth, not echo what sells. The air thickened. Even the studio's background hum seemed to fade. Van's composure cracked just slightly. That's rich coming from someone who's monetized her own truth better than most. The audience, small, private, selected for calm, shifted in their seats. The silence felt alive. Meghan didn't blink. I don't monetize my truth, she said evenly. I share it. The fact that people are willing to listen says more about the hunger for honesty than it does about me. Van exhaled through his nose, leaning back now. His tone softened, but not his intent. You see how it sounds, though, right? You've become the symbol of control, of turning pain into power. But control can isolate. Do you ever feel lonely in all that perfection? That was the first question that caught her. For half a second, something real, hurt, exhaustion, flickered behind her eyes. But it was gone before anyone could pin it down. I feel human, she said. And humans aren't perfect. They just get judged as if they should be. Van nodded, but the gleam in his eyes returned. Then maybe the issue isn't judgment. It's accountability. Meghan straightened, posture tall, unbothered. I've taken more accountability for my life than most people ever will. I walked away from a palace to protect my peace. How much more accountability do you need? The filmmaker whispered, Wow, under her breath. Van smiled, sensing the spark he'd been waiting for. Peace, he repeated. That's a word people love until it costs them their comfort. Meghan's gaze sharpened. Exactly. And you just proved my point. The critic on Van's left tried to interject, but the rhythm between the two of them had already locked into something magnetic, unstoppable, debate disguised as dialogue, or maybe the other way around. Van crossed his arms, leaning back slightly. You know, I think people wanted to see a version of you that struggled quietly, the private survivor. But instead, you went global. Oprah, podcasts, documentaries. That's power, but it's also spectacle. Would you say that to a man? Meghan asked flatly. Because last I checked, Male vulnerability gets called courage. Female vulnerability gets called performance. The studio's temperature dropped another degree. Van hesitated just long enough for the cameras to catch it, a visible shift from dominance to defense. "Fair," he said finally, voice measured. "But when you wield influence this big, don't you owe transparency?" Meghan leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her tone a whisper sharpened to a point. "Transparency without empathy is interrogation, and I don't owe anyone my trauma to prove my sincerity." Van opened his mouth, then paused. Something in her calm, not anger, just certainty, stalled him. The director's cue light flashed again, rap segment. But nobody moved. For a moment, the show had turned into something unscripted, something real. Meghan's hand rested on the table, steady. Van looked down at it, then back up at her face. There was respect there, but also challenge. "This conversation," he said quietly, "is why people watch this show." She smiled, a half smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And it's why I rarely do them anymore." Cut. The stage manager stepped in, announcing the next topic, the price of truth in media. But everyone knew that the real headline had already been written. When the red light blinked back on, Meghan's posture was immaculate again, poised, centered, guarded. But the oxygen in the room had changed. The tension from the last segment hadn't cooled. It had fermented. Van Lathan leaned in, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on Meghan like a surgeon about to make a precise incision. "Let's talk about control," he said. "You've built an empire out of it. Image control, narrative control, brand control. Do you ever worry that in controlling the story, you've stopped being part of it?" Meghan tilted her head, her tone even but edged. "If you're asking whether I live my life for the public, the answer is no. Control isn't manipulation, it's survival." "Survival," Van echoed. "That's a strong word. You're one of the most privileged people on Earth. 2 mansions, private security, streaming deals. Survival doesn't usually come with a Netflix contract." That landed like a punch disguised as a question. The critics shifted uneasily. Even the camera operator looked up from his monitor. Meghan blinked once, then smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't forgive. "You think privilege cancels pain? You think because I have success, I don't have scars? That's lazy thinking, Van." He chuckled, low and dismissive. "I'm just saying there's a difference between struggle and scrutiny." "And there's a difference," she fired back, "between commentary and cruelty." The table went silent. The older critic's pen froze mid-note. Van's voice softened, but the sharpness underneath remained. "You say that, but the public sees every interview you do, every headline, every speech, and they start wondering, is she still fighting a system, or just feeding it?" Meghan's tone dropped an octave. "Maybe the system never stopped feeding on people like me." That line cracked the air. Even Van paused for a beat. But then he smiled again, the kind of smile that said he was going to push harder. "All right," he said, "let's get real. You've talked about racism in the monarchy, mental health struggles, media lies. But some say you've told that story so many times, it's hard to tell where pain ends and PR begins." The filmmaker beside them looked mortified. Meghan's jaw tightened, her eyes flickered with disbelief. "I didn't come here to defend my trauma," she said slowly. "I came here to have a conversation." Van raised a hand. "This is a conversation. I'm just asking the questions people want answered." "No," she said sharply. "You're asking the questions that get clicks." The audience, a handful of journalists and crew, shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The sound felt explosive. Van leaned closer. "So you admit this is about publicity?" Meghan stared at him, unmoving. "What I admit," she said, "is that I expected a journalist, not a provocateur hiding behind cultural critique." That hit him. His smile faltered. "Provocateur? You're not having a dialogue, Van," she continued. "You're picking sound bites. You're twisting empathy into entertainment. That's not journalism. It's theater. For the first time, Van's composure cracked. You don't get to come here and rewrite the rules of the table, he said, voice rising. Then maybe your table needs new rules, Meghan shot back. Silence. It was the kind of silence that made the boom mic tremble. Van sat back, exhaling through a forced laugh. Wow. So, no one's allowed to challenge Meghan Markle, huh? The royal immunity still applies? Her head turned slowly toward him. The grace was still there, but now it was steel-coated. Don't confuse immunity with boundaries. You're allowed to challenge me. You're not allowed to disrespect me. The air was razor-thin now. The filmmaker's gaze darted between them, unsure whether to intervene or stay invisible. Van gestured toward her with a wry smirk. You've had an entire global platform to speak your truth. Oprah, Netflix, Spotify. And now when someone asks tough questions, it's suddenly disrespect? Meghan's voice steadied, low and measured. You can ask tough questions, but when your tone assumes bad faith before I even open my mouth, that's not tough. That's toxic. Van raised his brows. So now I'm toxic? I didn't say that, she said, pausing just long enough for it to sting. But maybe the culture you've built rewards toxicity more than truth. The producer motioned frantically behind the camera. Wrap soon, switch topics, but the two of them were locked in. Van leaned in again, voice heavy with mock sincerity. You know what I think, Meghan? I think you're addicted to victimhood. You've made a career out of being wronged. It's the only story you know how to tell. The entire set froze. Even the director lowered his headset. Meghan didn't move. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes hard as glass. Excuse me? You heard me, he said. Every time you're on camera, it's about what the world did to you. Maybe people just want to know who you are without the sympathy. Her reply came like ice. Who I am doesn't need your permission. For the first time all evening, Van didn't have a comeback. She leaned forward just enough for her words to land like a whisper with weight. You want authenticity? Here it is. I'm tired. Tired of men like you mistaking empathy for weakness. Tired of people who call my voice self-pity because it makes them uncomfortable. And tired of pretending this kind of conversation is progress. The cameras were still rolling, but nobody breathed. Van swallowed, the smugness fading. So, what are you saying? I'm saying, she said quietly, if this is what a modern table looks like, maybe I don't need a seat at it. The director's hand hovered over the signal button, unsure whether to cut. The filmmaker whispered, We're still live. But Meghan wasn't playing for the cameras anymore. Respect, she said, her voice now calm again, isn't a privilege, Van. It's a choice. He stared back at her, realizing too late that the conversation had slipped from his control, and as the cameras cut to commercial, the final time that night, the studio lights reflected in the empty water glasses like fractured mirrors. The silence that followed wasn't relief, it was recoil. The air in the studio had turned to glass. Every breath, every glance, every movement cracked through it. Van sat motionless, the faint reflection of stage lights cutting across his eyes. Meghan, once perfectly composed, now looked like someone holding back a storm she refused to let spill. When the cameras blinked red again, Van's tone had shifted. Gone was the subtle charm. What replaced it was sharper, colder, the tone of a man who thought he'd regained control. Welcome back, he said, looking into the lens, not at her. Before the break, we had a spirited exchange. Meghan, you said respect is a choice. Let's test that idea, shall we? He turned to her with that half-smile, the one he wore when he was about to throw a jab wrapped in intellect. People say you demand respect but rarely return it, that the second someone challenges you, you pull rank or play the victim. Are they wrong? The studio gasped in quiet disbelief. Even the sound engineer froze mid-adjustment. Meghan didn't look away. If defending yourself from unfair attacks is playing the victim, she said, then maybe the definition needs rewriting. Van chuckled dryly. That's a neat answer. But come on, it's not unfair to question contradictions. You've built an entire identity around being silenced. Yet here you are, talking more than anyone in the world. Her expression hardened. You know what's fascinating, Van? How comfortable people get questioning a woman's voice the moment she uses it. The tension rippled across the set. A few in the small studio audience nodded quietly. Van noticed, and it irritated him. He leaned closer, voice rising slightly. You talk about women's voices, empowerment, truth, but half the time the conversation circles back to you. Isn't that convenient? Meghan exhaled, her patience cracking just slightly. You keep calling it convenient, like authenticity is a strategy. Maybe that says more about how you see people than how I live. Or maybe, Van countered, you've learned to weaponize sympathy. That did it. The words hit the table like a hammer. The older critic whispered, "Oh, man." Under his breath, Meghan's face drained of warmth. For the first time that night, she blinked, slowly, deliberately, as if deciding whether the conversation was still worth having. You know what? She said, almost softly. You should think very carefully before using that word. Van didn't back down. Why? You've made a brand out of being misunderstood. No, she said, her voice suddenly razor-sharp. I've made a life out of surviving people like you. The room went dead still. Van laughed, but it was nervous now. See? That's what I mean. You twist everything into persecution. And you twist truth into spectacle, she said. You don't want honesty. You want a headline. He smirked. That's rich, coming from you. Meghan pushed her chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the floor, a sound that cut through the silence like a blade. I came here in good faith, she said, for a real conversation. But this isn't that. This is theater. You're not listening, Van. You're performing. Van straightened, now visibly tense. You can't come on my show and decide what's authentic. And you can't invite me on your show, she said, standing slowly, and think you can talk down to me because I'm polite enough not to bite back. The crew started moving nervously behind the cameras. The director whispered into his mic, "Keep rolling, don't cut." Van forced a laugh, trying to salvage authority. Oh, come on. Don't do this, Meghan. You're walking out because you can't handle a tough question? She looked down at him, calm now, disturbingly calm. No, I'm walking out because you can't handle accountability. Van's smirk vanished. Accountability for what? For mistaking provocation for journalism, she said, unclipping her mic. For thinking that empathy is weakness. For believing that you can insult someone and call it truth. The sound of the microphone hitting the table was louder than anyone expected. The filmmaker tried to speak. Maybe we can take a pause. But Meghan was already moving toward the exit. The audience, stunned, uncertain, began to clap. First one person, then another. Van turned toward them sharply. Don't clap. This isn't courage, it's ego. That only made them clap louder. Meghan stopped halfway to the door, turned, looked at him one last time. Ego, she said, is thinking you can humiliate people and still call it journalism. Then she walked off. The camera followed her to the edge of the set, where the soft studio lights fell away into shadow. She didn't hurry, didn't look back, just left, her heels echoing like punctuation marks in a story that no longer needed words. Van sat there, staring at the empty chair. You could see it in his face, the dawning realization that he'd pushed too far, too fast. He adjusted his jacket, forced a smile, looked back to the camera. Well, he said with false composure, I guess that's one way to end a conversation. No one laughed. The camera panned slightly, catching the table, the untouched water glasses, the coaster that still wouldn't lay flat, and an empty seat where civility used to be. Van sighed, glanced toward the control booth, and muttered, Cut the feed. The red light above the camera died, but the moment didn't. Because long after Meghan Markle had left that studio, the internet would replay that clip over and over. The walkout, the silence, the defiance. And for once, the narrative didn't belong to the host. It belonged to the woman who refused to let anyone rewrite her story. And that was the moment everything changed. A quiet studio, an empty chair, and the echo of a voice that refused to be silenced. Now I want to hear from you. Was she right to walk out? Or did Van just push too far? Tell me what you think down in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you love stories like this, where truth meets tension and silence becomes power, hit like, tap subscribe, and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss the next story that will have the entire internet talking.